getting used to this and actually expecting it. So thanks for your flexibility. This is always good information. We look forward to sharing any updates that we can with you. And as you know, this morning we have Chris Larimer from the University of Northern Iowa, and that's always one of our go-to exciting updates about what's going on with the campaigns, both national and state, and not as many local, but there are some additional state ones that are local. And Chris, you're welcome to comment on any of those, but I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to you, Chris. And then if those of you heard us earlier, we did share that if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. You can send them to me or to everyone, and I'll make sure that Chris gets that information. And if we have time and want to turn the microphones on, if you've got a face-to-face or a microphone-to-microphone question, you're welcome to ask those too. So let's go ahead and get started. Chris, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Sure, thanks, Cary. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Always enjoy chatting with this group. Look forward to it every year. So thank you again for the invitation. In terms of the format of the talk, you know, there's really not much going on in the political world right now, so I don't really think there's much to talk about. No, really, what I'd like to do, I have the chat box open, and so I'll try to respond to questions as best I can through the chat box if you have questions there. But my plan for today was to just have comments, about 15 minutes of comments, 15 to 20 minutes. I don't want to speak too long. I'd be happy to. I could keep going all day, but I think that'd be boring. So I'd like to do about 15 minutes and then open it up to questions from there, because I assume all of you have questions, and I have some questions for all of you as well. And so I'd like to keep this as much of a kind of a back and forth discussion as possible. The items that I guess I would like to discuss today are primarily just some of the trends I've seen throughout the election cycle, and kind of some maybe more general predictions about what we could expect going forward, what we can expect from the outcome of the election. And so I'll do it that way, and talking about kind of the perceptions of voters, but then also moving into some thoughts about the top three races really in Iowa in terms of thinking about the race for the president, the U.S. Senate, and then the congressional races. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And maybe toward the end, we can also talk about the breaking news overnight with the president and so forth. So, you know, one of the things well, let me say this. Two things, if you don't come away with this, if you come away with two things from this talk, it would be that voters are not persuadable, and that Iowa is still very much a swing state. And sort of as a sub-point to that, we are very, very lucky to live where we do in terms of competitive elections at the federal level. So those are the two main points. Those are the two take-homes. So if you have to leave, just keep those in your mind throughout the day and go from there. But starting with voters, what we continue to see, and there's been more research that's come out this year again, just talking about the fact that the voters are really not persuadable. And I know that's probably not particularly news to all of you, because all of you pay close attention to politics, but it is fascinating the extent to which people in the media will speculate about whether or not certain events really matter, and how that's going to move voters, how that's going to affect voters. When you really start to dig into the research on get out the vote field experiments, if you're just trying to mobilize voters, if you're looking at campaign ads in terms of trying to move voters' perceptions on the favorability of candidates or vote intention toward candidates, we have really yet to find systematic evidence that voters are persuadable. And in fact, there's some research from Pew Research, actually going back to the 2018 election cycle, that argues that for those who are most engaged in politics, those folks are actually more likely to change their religion than they are to change their political party. And so if you think about it that way, and if you think about it in terms of basic psychology of that sort of in-group, out-group, it really, you can see where the campaigns are going, because the campaigns are aware of a lot of this research. And there's actually a new book coming out by Kostas Panagopoulos called Bases Loaded. And I've worked with Kostas on some other get out the vote field experiments, but his basic argument, and he's gone and he's had this around for a while, and looked at data going back to the 2000 presidential election, and it's that really presidential elections have come down to mobilizing the party's base, and that's really all the party is interested in. So for all the media speculation about what does this mean for independent voters, what are moderate voters going to do, really campaigns are focused on mobilizing their base. And I think particularly in this election cycle, where you have the pandemic, where the pandemic has essentially removed the sort of most effective get out the vote technique in terms of personal outreach, right? Door-to-door canvassing. And I understand that there are reports that Republicans are doing a lot more door-to-door canvassing than Democrats, but I would be shocked if Republicans are knocking on doors of independents. They're certainly not going to be knocking on doors of Democrats, right? So it's still about mobilizing your base. And so, you know, there's data coming out looking at the number of undecideds in this election cycle, that number is down to that number is very, very small, particularly if you compare it to 2016, 2012, 2008, that there are fewer undecideds this election cycle. So for everything that's going on, right, if we're trying to process what does the breaking news mean this morning about the president testing positive for the coronavirus? What does it mean about, you know, the president's taxes and perceptions of fairness about whether or not someone who makes that much money should pay $750 in taxes? I think it's important to remember that voters, for the most part, if you are engaged in politics, that's an important caveat. If you're engaged in politics, for the most part, I want to be careful here, but for the most part, those events are not going to matter in terms of switching you from one party to the other. And when you start to think about it that way, you can start to understand campaigns a little bit easier, I think, and you know, you can put things into context a little bit easier, and maybe not. You know, I try to tell this to my parents because they get pretty fired up about politics on both sides, and you know, just trying to calm them down a little bit that really what's happening is that there's just a lot of base mobilization. It's really not about persuading voters. The other point I want to make is just about Iowa as a toss-up state. And this is something my colleague Donna Hoffman and I have argued for several years, and actually going back to following the 2016 election, we still made the case at that time that Iowa was very much a toss-up state, even though all media from outside of the state continued to write off Iowa as a red state. And in part, I think that's a reflection of what happened in the state level elections in 2016, where Iowa switched to unified Republican control. But we argued that the structural dynamics of the state, in terms of, you know, that we did have the Iowa caucuses, I don't know if we still will, but we do, and you know what that does for county level organization, what that does for precinct level party organization, and then also the political geography of the state, just that sharp rural-urban divide, what that does in terms of campaign dynamics, what that forces Democrats and Republicans to do as they campaign for statewide offices. We argued that Iowa was still very much a toss-up state, and now just in these last 2 weeks, we feel like the polls have sort of caught up to the argument we've been making all along. We've had 4 straight polls in Iowa, you know, with Monmouth, the New York Times Siena survey, the Des Moines Register Iowa poll, and then there was a poll that came out yesterday from Raba Research. All 4 of those polls show Iowa within the margin of error for the presidential race. And again, we would argue that that's sort of the dynamic we expected. Unless you have a candidate that is overwhelmingly popular or overwhelmingly embraced, someone maybe like a Barack Obama in 2008, where he's sort of this candidate that doesn't quite fit the norm of candidates we've seen in terms of really bringing out new people to the polls, Iowa's probably going to be a very tight race. It's and the way that the state is right now suggests that it's going to be a competitive race going forward. I'd say for all of us who are voters in the 1st Congressional District, we're also very fortunate. I was looking at Cook Political Report late last night, and if I was reading all their tables correctly, the 1st Congressional District here in Iowa is one of just 3 congressional districts in the entire country where, when we go to vote on election day or before, the top 3 races we vote for are all considered toss-ups right now. The presidential race, the U.S. Senate race, and the 1st District congressional seat. The only other 2 congressional districts in the country that are the same way are the 2nd Congressional District in Iowa and the 3rd Congressional District in Iowa. So that is very unique. And, you know, I think I certainly am going to use that when I talk to students about encouraging them to vote, about, you know, because you always hear that, well, does my vote really matter if it looks like the race is going one way or the other? You know, that's extraordinarily unique that we see that here in the first congressional district. And so I think we need to market that more and take advantage of that somehow in terms of encouraging people to get out to vote. With that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about each of the races and what I see in each race and what can work to the advantage of both candidates. And so if we start at the presidential race, it's obviously very close. You know, the prediction models that we use in political science for forecasting presidential elections are typically done anywhere from 3 to 6 months out from the election. This year, a lot of those models, though, have been upended because one of the key predictors that we use in those models is economic growth in the second quarter of the election year. Well, economic growth in the second quarter of this year was obviously thrown off by the pandemic. And so it's hard to know exactly what's happening there, what effect that's going to have, because typically perceptions of the economy matter for vote choice in a presidential election, or they affect perceptions of the incumbent. But for the president, what he has going for him is that his base of supporters, by most polls, at least the ones I've seen, have really not left him. That if you voted for Trump in 2016, you're probably still leaning toward voting for Trump in 2020. Now, there's been a little bit of movement away, but not a lot. Not the mass movement away that a lot of people, I think, expected. And if anything, I think that shows something that political science got right. You know, there was a lot of talk after 2016 that political science messed up, that we didn't see it coming in 2016, that we didn't read the polls correctly, that we didn't understand the probabilities of modeling correctly, and you know that we underestimated Donald Trump's chances in 2016. What we're seeing now, 4 years later, is showing where political science got it right in terms of the strength of party identification. I was just talking to a reporter the other day from Virginia who was doing some research on understanding rural voters in Virginia and Montana, Iowa, and elsewhere around the Midwest. And I've got this question before about what are rural farmers doing? What are farmers doing? What are rural voters doing? Voters who potentially could be seeing policies put into place by the Trump administration that are hurting their own economic self-interest, right? That are hurting them really in their pocketbooks. Are they leaving Trump? And really, I've yet to see evidence of that. And so I think what that speaks to is just the strength of party identification. Once you align with the party, and like I said earlier, if you think about it in terms of in-group and out-group, you really stay with that party over time. And so for Trump, he hasn't had people, Trump voters in 2016 really haven't left Trump in mass in 2020. Another advantage he has is that despite his low ratings on his handling of the pandemic, voters still give him the edge in most polls on his handling of the economy. And so if the economy still matters for voters in terms of their perceptions of whether or not they decide to vote and how they vote, right now Trump has an advantage over his opponent on his handling of the economy. So those two things are working in his favor. And then the third thing that works in his favor right now is we've seen a lot of polls that ask Trump and Biden voters why they are voting for that candidate. And so that what the polls will do now is say, if you decided to vote, say you're going to vote for Trump, are you voting for Trump as a vote for Donald Trump or as a vote against Joe Biden? And the same thing they'll ask of Biden supporters. Are you supporting Joe Biden because you're voting for Joe Biden or because you're voting against Donald Trump? What a lot of the swing state polls are telling us is that there's an overwhelming difference there between Trump and Biden supporters. Trump supporters, by large margins, are saying they're voting for Donald Trump because they're voting for Donald Trump. 80 to 85, 86% of Trump voters say they're voting for Donald Trump because they're voting for Donald Trump. When you look at Biden supporters, it's not quite evenly split, but it's pretty close, where I think in Iowa, in the latest New York Times poll, they had it at about 49-42. That is, if you ask Biden supporters, why are you voting for Joe Biden? 49% say they are voting for, or 48% say they're voting for Joe Biden because they're voting for Joe Biden, whereas 41-42% say they're voting for Joe Biden as a vote against Donald Trump. And so there's a question there about the strength of support for each candidate. And I think, we have seen some polls that suggest Trump supporters are more enthusiastic about their candidate than Biden supporters are about their candidate. So those things are working for Trump. In terms of what's working for Biden, obviously his perception of, or the perception that's out there of his handling of the pandemic, right? He's perceived as being more capable of handling the pandemic, of doing it in a more responsible way. And so to the extent that the pandemic is weighing on voters' minds, and it is, if you look at Gallup has the most important problem question that they always ask the voters of, what are the most important problems facing the country today? Healthcare, but really the pandemic and the current outbreak are right up there at the top. Biden is leading on that issue. So that's to the advantage of Joe Biden. Another thing that we've seen in the polls is that Joe Biden is leading significantly among female voters. He's up double digits in most swing state polls among female voters. So, going forward, that's going to be something that's going to be watched. I think that's one of the key metrics to look at when we get closer to the election. And then as far as other demographics, Joe Biden continues to lead among young voters, those 18 to 29-year-olds, as well as those who are 65 and over. And he has narrowed the gap among non-college white voters, particularly in Iowa. So those are some metrics that are working to the advantage of Joe Biden. It's just a question of will they hold when it comes to voting on election day. If you look at the U.S. Senate race, and I'll kind of move quickly through these, for Senator Joni Ernst, and really for Teresa Greenfield, the challenge at this point is how do they get around the narrative around the presidential race? Because the narrative around the presidential race right now is so loud that it is hard for them to really get their message out, and it's hard for them to sort of disassociate themselves from the two leading candidates. As this race has gotten closer over time, where it's to the point of being a toss-up, Teresa Greenfield's been up a couple of points in recent polls, but those are all within the margin of error. For them, the challenge is getting outside of that presidential narrative. And for Joni Ernst, what's been interesting to watch is the extent to which she has tried to distance herself from the president. As the president continues to be an extremely polarizing figure, it's been interesting to see where does she try to separate herself from the president and take positions that are opposite of the president. Now, she's done that on the renaming of military bases that are named after Confederate generals. She's done that on the renewable fuel standard and ethanol and exemptions for oil companies. But we haven't seen a lot of it. And now she's going to be potentially forced to take a vote on a Supreme Court nominee, which she has said she will take that vote and approve the nominee. So she's really running out of options at this point to try to distance herself. And on top of that, she was featured prominently at the Republican National Convention. So for Joni Ernst, this was always going to be a difficult election because she was going up for re-election. It's her first time doing that, which research shows is typically the most difficult. And she's running in a presidential year where turnout in Iowa is anywhere from right around 450,000 more voters in a presidential year than it is in a midterm year. And she's running with shared party affiliation with the president, who is extraordinarily polarizing. So this was going to be a difficult election for Joni Ernst outside of everything else that's going on. For Teresa Greenfield, I think she's in part benefiting from the negative perceptions around the president. She is doing extremely well among female voters in polls. The margin that she has among female voters over Joni Ernst it matches pretty close to what we see with Joe Biden over Donald Trump among female voters. So she seems to have locked in that demographic and doing well among younger voters. The challenge for her, though, when we think in terms of political science, is that she has never held elected office. And we always talk about the strength of the challenger as part of that being related to holding elected office before, because that with that comes certain things in terms of how you campaign, name recognition and so forth. All of that, though, is changing, like I've said, because of the way we campaign, because of the way campaigning has proceeded in 2020 with the pandemic. The last thing I just wanted to mention was just on the congressional races, and I'm not going to go through all 4 of them, but I think it's interesting that the Iowa poll has all 4 congressional races within the margin of error. Now, the Iowa poll asked that question a little bit differently. They ask, if the election were held today, would you vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate? That's different than asking, would you vote for Abby Finkenauer or Ashley Hinson here in the 1st Congressional District? With that being said, though, I still think the 1st Congressional District is going to be a very, very close race. It has been among the top 10 most competitive in the country the last several election cycles. And when you think about U.S. House races, that's important because typically 90 to 92% of incumbents are reelected in the U.S. House. And very few of those races are competitive. So we live in one of these competitive House districts. So that's, that's exciting, I guess, if you like competitive elections. But just the makeup of the district can be challenging because it like the 3rd Congressional District, it really is that sharp rural-urban divide. You have 3 counties of Lynn, Dubuque, and Blackhawk that are more urban. But outside of that, and really once you get outside the cities in those counties, Iowa, in terms of party registration, becomes very, very conservative and very Republican. And so for Abby Finkenauer, this was going to be a tough re-election, regardless, just because of the makeup of the district, the rural-urban divide in the district. Democrats have taken somewhat of a sizable advantage in terms of party registration over Republicans in the district and over no party voters in the district. Typically, this is a district that has the highest proportion of no party voters in the state. But it was going to be a challenge for her. And on top of that, now she's running against Ashley Hinson, who does have elected office experience as a member of the Iowa General Assembly. And she has name recognition on top of that with her work in television. And so this was going to be a difficult race. And then you have a relatively strong challenger. So I would expect going forward that would be that this will be a pretty competitive race. I think as a more general comment, it really, and I was talking to Betty about this before we started going this morning. One of the things, I guess one of the questions I have for all of you, and this is a question I continue to struggle with, and I ask students about this as well, is to what extent do events really matter anymore? If we are so polarized, and every poll continues to show that we are very, very polarized, that among active voters, we are really moving into the Democratic and Republican camps, that there are, at least this election cycle, that there are fewer undecideds, that people really seem to dig in when any sort of conflicting information comes out, that people really do have that in-group, out-group mentality. And on top of that, social media allows us to sort into our groups, right? We can take in information that we agree with and get our news that way and ignore everything else. So if that's the way we are processing things, and we know about the psychology of information processing, about the way that we do that, the biases that we have in terms of how we process information, at this point, my question to students is always, to what extent do events really matter, right? So a lot of attention given to the president's tax returns when they come out. But what does that really mean, right? It may mobilize Democrats, it may mobilize Republicans, but it's not necessarily going to change minds. With the breaking news this morning, right, that the president has tested positive for the coronavirus, right? There are all sorts of things to think about what that means for the presidential election. But at the end of the day, is that really going to move? How that's processed, I think it's probably a little too early to know because we haven't heard much from the president talking about it and so forth. But even things like the Supreme Court nomination, something that's going to go beyond the president, because it is a lifetime appointment, something that extends to all aspects of public policy, from civil liberties to civil rights, to every single aspect of public policy you can think of. There is the potential for significant change there. Is that going to persuade somebody who's already actively involved in politics, right? Because those are the folks that campaigns are reaching out to. Now, they may try to reach out to intermittent voters, those folks who maybe have voted 2 in the last 5 presidential elections. But for those who we know with pretty high degree of certainty are going to show up on election day, to what extent does all of this matter? And I think that's the question I still struggle with. So it's 8:25. I spoke way too long. I'm sorry about that. What questions do all of you have?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm on now, and I would ask if any of you have questions, either put them in the chat or unmute your mic and just go ahead and ask your question. Chris, thank you very much for that overview, and certainly didn't talk too long. So questions, folks.
I'll look at the question in the chat. Andrew asked, are there any studies that estimate what our turnout might be? Do we have any projections, rural, urban? I think the projections I've seen are that it, potentially could be high. I think this year's, it's really hard to get a good sense because of the high numbers of vote by mail / absentee ballots that are expected. That number is going to be so high. It's hard to get a good sense of if that includes any new voters. You can get a really good sense of the trends over time. If you go to, here, I'll pull it up, election studies, or not election studies, the United States Election Project with Michael McDonald. He has a fantastic website and data repository on turnout, primary elections, presidential elections, and looking at it over time. If I can pull that up. Let's see here. You guys just have to look at my fingers while I type, because my camera is on the bottom. I'll pull up that website and put it in the chat box. All right. And it's the that's the source I use a lot, Andrew, when I start pulling the turnout data. Good question, Randy. I have no idea about how long we will wait for election results. I figured someone would ask that. I guess I would say within Blackhawk County, I feel confident right now that we should get those results relatively quickly. I've talked to Karen Showalter, who all of you know is the elections manager down at works with Grant Reeder in the county auditor's office as the election manager. And because we were talking about just ways to encourage college students to vote and making sure the information got out to college students, they seem pretty confident that they'll be able to process the ballots in a timely way, that they should be able to get that done by 9-10 o'clock on election night. That the Secretary of State's office has allowed that exemption to go through, so counties can start counting the ballots earlier than the day before the election or the day of election. I think that's helped them. So within Blackhawk County, I feel pretty confident. Karen has said they've already spoken to the United States Postal Service about the processing of the ballots, about their ability to handle those, and they put out press releases talking about that, and they feel confident. As far as the thousands of other counties around the country, I have no idea how that's gonna play out. Some states you're hearing they feel pretty confident about getting this done and getting it done in a timely way. Other states, I think there are still some question marks. So right now I feel confident certainly about Blackhawk County. It seems like in Iowa generally that's the case. I don't know about these other states. And right now, we're still down to those handful of toss-up states. Right now, it's Iowa, Florida, Georgia, I guess by the Cook Political Report, Ohio and North Carolina as far as toss-ups. And it's hard to get a good sense in those states what's going to happen.
Here's a question, Chris. What impact do you think some of the prominent endorsements in competitive states will have, such as the Republicans endorsing Biden?
I think, before this election cycle, the research on the question of, quote, do endorsements matter, was a kind of a tricky one, but there wasn't a lot of evidence that it really did anything. So I see that as Republicans endorsing Joe Biden that may reassure some Democratic voters. For folks who are leaning toward Trump or voted for Trump in 2016, I'd be surprised if that does anything in terms of moving them away from their candidate. Because again, we want to, the way to think about party ID and party loyalty from political science is that some researchers have talked about it in terms of it's a core part of your social identity. So that's pretty hard to break. And you know, the voter that it might have an effect on would be someone who is truly undecided at this point. Because I mean, if you pay attention to politics, your mind is made up about the president. You either like him or you don't at this point. I think he's you know, a very, I think you can say he's a polarizing figure just based on the polling data. He's, you know, obviously a somewhat confrontational figure. And so, you know, people who follow politics, they have their mind made up about the president. I think it would just be for that small slice of voters who, you know, who are undecided, who maybe are considering voting, who maybe didn't vote the last election cycle. But that's hard to get a good measure of how many people that is. But even a small number of people can make a difference, right? That 100,000 people in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania swung those 3 states. I mean, that means a small number of people can matter, but it's hard to know on endorsements. I know that's a long answer there, sorry.
No problem. So kind of shifting focus away from the national elections, we have a question as to if you have any predictions for the House and Senate in Des Moines. Will the State House remain the same or change? Is the trifecta still good, or is it going to be crumbled a little bit this year?
Well, you know, the folks who look at this, and even those outside of Iowa, there are a few political scientists who will rank state legislative chambers. You know, and most people see the Iowa Senate as staying Republican just because of the size of the margin there. I think that's one that's pretty difficult to overcome. But some ratings organizations are putting the Iowa House as being in play as either lean Republican or in that toss-up category because the margin is so close. You know, that it just takes a few seats to do that. The challenge with the state legislative races, and I always want to be careful with those, is particularly once you get down to the Iowa House level where, you know, the average district size there is 30,000 people. Party ID still matters, right? We've said that that's part of your social identity, but at that level, it gets down to personal connections as well. And what we don't know, at least I haven't seen any research yet, is the extent to which personal connections could somehow override or overtake any sort of partisan loyalty. And so those races become a little bit more difficult, but the fact that that margin's that close, that turnout's a little bit up in the air, and that the top of the ticket is so polarizing, you know, those 3 things to me suggest that the Iowa House could potentially flip control this year.
Good. The president being tested positive for coronavirus, how could this affect the outcome of the elections in Iowa and the U.S. with just 30 days remaining? What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I'm still trying to process that a little bit. You know, Betty and Cary and I were talking about that a little bit before we started. You know, what effect does that have on the debates going forward? Does it cancel the debates? Does it cancel the vice presidential debate, or does it just move those to virtual debates? And really, there's a question in political science about do debates really matter? Now, the debate earlier this week was an unusual one, I guess you could say. But, you know, I don't know. I think it's too early to know on what this means for the president testing positive. Because I think part of how that plays out is going to be how he talks about it. What he says about quarantining, what the perception of that is, you know, how serious is his health condition. You know, I think all of that's going to play into that. What it means for the Supreme Court nomination process. If somehow that would get, the timeline on that would move around, because obviously the president had conversations one-on-one with Amy Coney Barrett, the nominee, Does that mean that she then has to quarantine? But I mean, we can still move forward virtually with some of this, but I think that one is a little bit too early to know. But back to my question about do events matter? You know, I don't know if does this move people one way or the other.
Good. Okay. Here's.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say there was the question there about Iowa farmers, right?
Yep.
It says that the president has disrupted trade relationships that Iowa farmers have built over the years. On the other hand, there have been those packages that have gone out, those spending aid packages to farmers. That is probably one of the most common questions I get from reporters outside the state trying to understand what's going on in Iowa. And that goes really back to even 2017, 2018 about, you know, the president's so-called trade wars with China, his backing out of certain deals. You know, what effect does that have? Are farmers going to leave Trump, right? If you're a farmer and you supported Trump in 2016, do these policies that hurt you economically, are they forcing you to leave the president? And as I was talking to that reporter the other day, the person from Virginia, he's seeing the same thing, and he's heard the same thing from others in Montana and elsewhere, is that not really. That rural voters and to some extent farmers are really not leaving the president, or at least we're not seeing that in polling yet. And again, I think that speaks to that strength of party identification. I know I keep saying that, but it does seem to be that people are not doing that. And there's an argument for this going back several election cycles. There's an older book published in, you know, I think the early 2000s by Thomas Frank, the What's the Matter with Kansas book, right? And that's all about why on earth would farmers vote for Republican candidates who are pushing policies that are against their economic self-interest? Well, part of it is just more of an identification, right? It's based on social identity. And so I think we're seeing that play out again. It may seem unusual, but you know, your party ID is not always your economic self-interest. Those things don't always line up. It's more about how you identify with the candidate and what that means for your social identity.
Excellent. We've got another question in the chat. What's your opinion of tribal politics and the continued erosion of the middle undecided voters? Where do those people find a home if we're all in tribal politics? What does the person in the middle do anymore?
Well, I think the danger with the tribal politics, and there's been a lot written in political science over the last 2 years about this. I think the danger with tribal politics is that you turn people off from political engagement. That if it's an intermittent voter who is kind of interested in politics, but every time they try to have a conversation with friends or family members, it becomes heated, and that tribal politics emerges, that really intense in-group, out-group. I think the danger is there that you're turning off voters. Or for younger voters who are 18, 19 years old this year, 20 years old, they're voting in their first presidential election, the overwhelming negativity surrounding the political process potentially turns those voters off. And that's really unfortunate, because we know that if you vote once, you're more likely to vote again, right? That there's this habit forming effect to voting. And for voters in the middle, I think that's the danger. That's also the danger, that you could potentially turn people off, that they may not want to become engaged, and they still vote, but they continue to be extremely distrustful of the political system because they don't like all the cynicism in politics. That they don't feel like they can have sort of a neutral conversation with someone, and so they struggle to talk about politics. They struggle to engage in politics. They maybe vote, but that's about the extent of it, because they don't want to go beyond that in terms of getting involved with the political system or the policy system.
Good thoughts. Other questions? Does anybody have another question for Chris?
Chris, you ask about do events matter? And it always seemed to me like that events don't matter so much at the top level because we don't have the personal connection, and you kind of touched on that. But when you get down to the House of Representatives for the state of Iowa, get down to the local races, contacts and personal knowledge have an important role to play. So my take on that is that they matter more for the down the ticket than they do at the top side.
Yeah, thanks, Willard. And obviously you would know better than I would. And I agree with you. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. Because at the local level, it's not only an event, but it's an event you can actually talk to the person running about for the office with, right? You can actually have that connection with that person. So I think you're right. That's a good way to look at it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Randy asks, is there a future for moderates in either party?
If they can get through the primary, but the struggle is to getting through, at least at the national level, seems to be getting through a primary election. And even once they get to Washington, D.C., it doesn't seem to be. I mean, there's, and I'll put another website in the chat session for you, but there are folks who do track roll call votes, and they've tracked them all the way back to the founding of the country, really. And what they found is that there really isn't any room anymore, or not that there's any room, but that there's been, things are so polarizing right now that you look at the roll call votes of the two members of both parties, and there's really no middle. I'll put that in there right now. Whereas before, if you think about them as sort of two bell curves, you know, there was, oops, I only replied to Andrew on that one. Sorry, let me do that again. I think I did that on the other one too. Andrew, will you post that? The one website I did, sorry, thank you. You know, if you think about the roll call votes of members of Congress as sort of bell curves for Democrats and Republicans, it used to be that the two bell curves were there, but that there was some overlap on the tails. Now, if you look at those bell curves, there's an enormous gap between the two, and that gap is at historic levels. So unless the more extreme members of either party are punished at the polls, then I don't know where moderates go. And it's a cycle, right? Because if the work that I talked about by Kostas Panagopoulos is right, that parties are just about organizing their base, then those base supporters tend to be more extreme in their views. They're going to be putting more extreme members in political office. And if that's who campaigns target, then it's just this cycle of continuing to see a larger and larger gap, or at least that gap maintained between the two parties. And so unless all of that, unless campaigning changes, unless voter outreach strategies change, and unless voters decide, unless a new group of voters or more independent voters or a sizable portion of voters go to the polls, I don't know where moderates go. And I think that's, I mean, you just look at the experience of someone like Susan Collins in Maine, the difficulty she's having in casting any sort of vote that breaks with party ranks. So to your question, Randy, I don't know where moderates go unless there is a fundamental change in voter perceptions, in campaign strategies, and just sort of voter mentality, as well as what the candidates do in office. I don't know where moderates go.
Another question. Could you share thoughts about the strategies where the Democrats this year seem to be doing mostly phone calls? Republicans are still doing door knocking, but typically door knocking seemed to be a forte for the Democrats. Do you think that people will appreciate the fact that they're not having people come to their door in this time of COVID, or will that give a big advantage to the Republicans who continue to do door knocking? What are your thoughts?
I think that reflects, again, each party's attempt to mobilize their base and the politics that's around people's response to the pandemic, whether it's social distancing, wearing masks, or even canvassing. Republicans, because those issues have become so political, mask wearing, social distancing, that those things are so political now and sort of ingrained as part of each party. Like I said earlier, I'd be surprised if because obviously when you canvass, you have a list of prospective voters. I would be surprised and shocked if Republicans are using or knocking on doors of Democratic voters. And so I think they're playing to their base in each case. But again, it's unusual in that we know how effective door-to-door canvassing is. I think that's one of the questions I have. Once the campaign's over, I want to talk to people in the campaigns to get a sense of what messages are they using that still create that sense of a personal touch or a personal connection when they can't actually be in front of individual voters. And so understanding what are Democrats doing, right? Because if we know from research, the more personal the message, the more individualized the message, and particularly if you can be right in front of the voter, those are effective ways to get people out to vote. So what are campaigns doing in the absence of those strategies? How are they still trying to create that perception? I don't know that it gives that the two parties have adopted different strategies. I think just reflects the politics of the pandemic at the moment.
Another question, with all the unrest in Portland and Seattle, is there any chance, in your opinion, that Oregon and Washington could be in play for the Republicans this election cycle?
At the presidential level, I'd still be very, very, very surprised if those did not go for the Democratic candidate, if they did not go for the Biden-Harris ticket. Because again, to Willard's point and what we were talking about earlier, as far as events mattering, I think the way that people process what they see on TV related to some of the unrest or the protests or the various movements around the country, I think we know chances are those things are all processed through a partisan lens. And I always use the example, and we know that perceptions of the economy are filtered through a partisan lens. One of the interesting things is that you can go back into Gallup, if you're interested, and look at perceptions on Russia. Suddenly, perceptions on Russia flipped from the fall of 2016 to the spring of 2017 among Republican-leaning voters. Well, the reason is there was a change in who was president of the United States and what he had expressed about Russia, right? So even our views on a foreign policy, someone who some would consider a foreign policy adversary, flipped because of partisan attachment. So I think those events are still going to be filtered through a partisan lens.
Hey, Chris, this is Brady Groon. How you doing this morning?
Hey, Brady, good. How are you doing?
Good. So just a quick question. It seems that we've got the two-party system, but that almost seems to be a little bit of an oversimplification as you see, as you were mentioning, more people kind of running to the extremes, right or left, in each party. Do you think there's ever any room or any future for these parties to fracture or turn into the quote unquote third party with any success, or are the machines too big, too powerful, too much money to ever see anything like that materialize?
Yeah, good question. I think it's probably the latter there, because at least what we've seen recently is that the parties seem to absorb any sort of outside movement, right? So the Democratic Party kind of absorbed that. If you remember back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Republican Party sort of absorbed the Tea Party movement, because yes, there are Tea Party candidates, but when they run on the ballot, they don't, it doesn't say Tea Party next to their name, it says Republican. And so I think it's, the parties are able to absorb those movements. And I think as long as they continue to do that, it's going to be extremely difficult for any third party to get real traction, particularly at the national level. It is a lot of money, and like I said, the parties just seem to absorb the movements rather than allow those to turn into sort of an independent faction or an independent third party.
Chris, following up on that, if President Trump would lose, the Republicans have kind of become the party of Trump. But do you think that when they reflect on what's happened and so on, that there could be a splitting of the Republican Party in some way or another between the folks that want to continue to go down the Trump line versus people that kind of yearn for the days of old in the grand old party?
I think that's going to depend a little bit on where those candidates are from. I think there's the potential for some sort of split, but even within that, I still see that as sort of a split within the Republican Party that's still absorbed, just like the Tea Party movement. So, you know, there are still the sort of the Tea Party candidates or kind of the Tea Party caucus within the Republican Party. I would expect that to maybe stay the same, but you would still have the Republican Party, and I don't see any sort of major split where it really affects anything when we go to the polls that we would see something different other than the Democrat and Republican Party candidates on the ballot. So it may depend. Some Republicans may, you know, if the president would lose his reelection bid, some Republicans may feel a little bit easier about taking a more moderate stance on some issues, may quickly distance themselves from the president, may not mention the president following the election as much as they normally would. But I don't see it causing a major fracture within the Republican Party, at least to the extent that you would see, you know, two different parties coming out of that. I think you would just have those pockets within the Republican Party.
Good. Here's what we'll call our last question. And Kim Fethgetter asks, what are your students saying about this process? Certainly Gen Z folks have a much different mindset about politics and the polarization that's happening. Just curious on how their attitudes and behaviors may impact future elections.
Yeah, it's interesting. So this semester I'm teaching an Intro to American Politics class, which is perfect for an election cycle. And a lot of those most of those students are not political science students. And so, you know, they are getting engaged. You know, we've had a couple of good discussions about voting, about the voting process. They have questions, you know, about you know, the security around elections. You know, I mean, they're paying attention certainly to what they're hearing in the news about the voting process generally, and have questions about that. So I think, you know, they are engaged. It's hard to get a good read on where they fall ideologically. You know, so that's a little more difficult. But you know, they do seem to be fairly engaged this cycle, and it seems like as we've got just even from August until now, the level of engagement, the level of interest, the level of discussion has increased considerably over the last 5 to 6 weeks.
Interesting. Well, hey, thank you very much, Chris, for being with us this morning. Certainly lived up to everything I could have hoped for out of this session, and I'm sure that everybody else appreciates it as well. If we were all together, we'd give you a big clap of the hands, but hey, here's to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I always enjoy it, Steve, Cary, Betty. Thank you, everybody. Always good to see all of you. Good to see a lot of familiar names out there too. So thank you, everyone.
Good.
I do want to make a quick announcement. I know, Steve, you're about ready to introduce that, but we do